Awesome. Thank you all for coming. And unfortunately, two members of our panel weren't able to come today, but I just want to acknowledge them. Christina Steinbrecher-Pfandt, who runs blockchain.art, and Richard Jacobs, who's a wonderful artist from Vermont. So I hope you can catch up with them on social media and in the metaverse. And my name's Ann Spalter, and we're going to talk to you today about digital art and the traditional art world and NFTs and how they relate to each other. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and introduce the other panelists who are going to talk about themselves. And then we'll hear about what we think happened in the last year, which has been a crazy but awesome year in many ways, and have some dialogue. And because we don't have all our panel members and have some extra time, I'm hoping that this can be a little bit interactive and we can get some questions from the audience. So if you think you might want to interact with us and ask questions, please feel free to come sit closer up and engage with us at the end and ask some questions. So my name's Ann Spalter, and I've been in the traditional art world and the digital art world forever and ever, a million years in internet time. I was trained in traditional art world techniques, drawing, painting, but have been doing digital art for decades, and also have a digital art collection of early computer art that I've been collecting with Michael Spalter since the early 1990s. So I've been very immersed in the field. Also started the first digital fine art courses at Brown University and the Rhode Island School of Design, and got into making NFTs in the fall of 2020. I actually was invited to be on a panel about collecting NFTs and then realized I didn't know what they were. So jumped in and learned, and I think like everyone else wondered why someone would download a JPEG and pay money for it, but then became an addict and a real lover of NFTs and started making them and selling them and became a true believer. So, and the last year has been wonderful for me as an artist and collector of NFTs. So I think that summarizes where I come from, sort of from both sides. And interestingly, the panelists sort of come from, one from the digital side and one more from the traditional art side. So I will let them introduce themselves. Emily.
Thank you, Anne. Hi, I'm Emily Wigoder. I'm here from London. I run Ad Astra, which is an NFT agency for the traditional art world. So we work with galleries, artists, governments with art collections, rare book dealers, really anyone who has artwork that they would like to bring into the NFT space, but either doesn't have the understanding, the time, or the funds to do so. We offer everything from education workshops, which we run both for our clients and for law firms, accountancy firms, etc., who want to understand the NFT space. We also do creative direction. We build NFT collections for our clients. We also then do legal protection as much as is possible in the space, which I think we'll touch on a bit more later, and also the marketing and sales of the NFT collections. So that's kind of what I'm up to at the moment. My background is in arts publishing and a little bit in art law. So very much new to the digital side of things. I wish I could code much better than I can. Looking forward.
And you were telling me how you got into NFTs, which from the law part.
So, I mean, I first got into NFTs, I was getting into art law and writing a lot of legal articles about how we can protect artists' rights. And I started looking at NFTs really just to write a quick article. I thought it might take me a day or two to understand, what was going on to protect artists' legal rights within the NFT space. Legally, NFTs weren't considered artworks at the time. In many places, they still aren't, which means they're not automatically protected by copyright law. And so it was a question around where were the legal contracts. And back in early 2020, the closer I looked, I went, oh God, where are the legal contracts? And realized in order to answer how I could protect artists' legal rights, I really had to understand the NFT space a bit better. So took myself to ETH Lisbon, spent 4 days running around asking every question I could, meeting a whole bunch of wonderful people. And from there, entered a rabbit hole I never really crawled out of. So thank you for having me. August.
Yeah, so pretty much my name's August Rosedale, and I kind of have started in this space in 2020 at the very end, and was just focusing mainly on AI art, and was just kind of in awe by all this open source tech that you can just kind of get access to and play with, and then educate yourself through that. And so starting with that, I started this project called Mirage Gallery. And then going into 2021, as NFTs kind of blew up, as we all know, kind of just started diving deeper and deeper down that path, and started with just creating these entirely AI-created artists, and then that turned into a different project with evolving art, where when you sell it on the secondaries, it actually will evolve into a further trained version of the same piece. And then from there, we kind of went on to trying to find other artists who are focusing on AI, and then having them do drops through Mirage Gallery, and kind of just taking it from there and seeing where things go. So, yeah.
Awesome. So what are the takeaways from the last year of NFT art? And as you might know, we sort of got grouped into panels randomly. So I'm kind of the nominal moderator, but I'm going to answer that question as well from my own perspective. And looking back on it from my pretty long view of this whole field, as well as the last year, I think it's kind of another year of what I'm calling my Harry met Sally sort of experience of the traditional art world and digital art. It keeps seeming like they're going to get together, and then for whatever reason, they don't. So last year at this time, I felt like they were definitely getting together. At Art Basel, there were all these NFTs, and the market was booming, and it definitely seemed like it was going to happen. And now ETH is at half the price it was last year. At Art Basel, there were many fewer NFTs. And in a lot of ways, it seems like the NFT world is sort of pulling apart again from the traditional art world. So it's been a fascinating and roller coaster kind of journey, and a little bit mysterious. So I feel like it's always kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. There's definitely interest from the traditional art world, and it's interesting that Pace now, has a whole NFT arm to it. And there's people from the traditional art world obviously interested in coming in, and all these booths out there. And yet those 2, circles in a Venn diagram don't seem to be overlapping as much as one would think. So that's sort of my takeaway so far.
I think that's really interesting, because I think, around a year ago, I was walking into galleries, auction houses for exhibitions, and the curators there would say, "Oh, what do you do?" And I'd say, "Oh, I work in NFTs." And the moment I mentioned NFTs, there was kind of a look of, "Oh, really?" And, they'd kind of walk away very deeply uninterested. And that really began to shift around maybe November, December last year. Suddenly, I'd be in galleries and I'd say, "Oh, I work in NFTs." And there'd be almost a lunge forward of, "Please, can we get coffee? I really want to understand them." And I think increasingly there's been a real thirst for knowledge about NFTs, about how they work. And now, every time I speak to an artist who's not from the NFT space about NFTs, it's not that they don't want to be in the space, it's that they can't reach it. And I think that's kind of the turning point we're at now, is building better education access for artists to understand what an NFT is and why it's relevant for them. What are the utilities? How can they play with them? And I know, August, you've had some fun playing with potential kind of use cases of NFTs.
Yeah, no, I think something that's important to think about when you're doing NFTs or having a project that is involved with NFTs is that the NFT should be an underlying technology that makes sense to be applying for whatever project you're doing. Because I feel like when people ask me, like, what have you been doing or what is your project, my answer is always AI art. Because when I started it, the NFTs were just supposed to just be kind of this a certificate of authenticity of the ownership of the piece. It was supposed to be the AI art was kind of the project, and then the NFTs is just this technology that made sense to apply for this scenario. So I think it's important to also like give education on just the actual technical side of things and what is possible with the technology, so that people can go further than just saying, I'm trying to do an NFT project, and can instead have their project that might be something different, but then they have some part of it that it makes sense for them to have an NFT or something else blockchain related. So I kind of think, or have been thinking, that that is probably an important thing to think about when you're coming up with a project, to not just think about, I want to do an NFT, but it's like, you should want to do your project, and if it makes sense to do it with NFTs, then actually consider like looking deeper into that and figuring out how to get that done, and talk to people like Emily who are helping people kind of figure all that out, you know?
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. It's hard if you're a painter and you just scan your painting and put it out there to attract an audience for that. And when I was looking back at the NFTs that I have minted in the past year, I also noticed, and this really resonated when we were all talking, I saw that the ones that I've done in the past year were almost all text-to-image AI. And that was another thing that I thought it really sort of pulled away from the traditional art world. So I have a lot of friends in the traditional art world, and almost none of them are working with AI, and 0 of them are working with text-to-image AI, whereas almost everyone I know in the NFT world is experimenting with DALL-E, with Midjourney, with all of the really fun tools that are out there. And I think that's a way that the NFT community is actually driving the art world and what art is forward, and is kind of leapfrogging the traditional art world. So I wonder if you guys want to comment on that.
I mean, sure, yeah, to touch on AI and AI art, I think what has been shown as this time has gone on, because I think more in 2020 at the beginning, it was not as common that you were seeing projects done with AI, but now there's been this interesting thing where all these tools are coming out where people with no technical knowledge of it can just play with it, which is awesome, but it also kind of gets to be where you have just more and more people doing it, which from what I've seen has kind of proven itself to be a tool more than just something that creates art you're going to sell. It shows that the people who are actually trying out all these different things are figuring out how to actually show their own creativity through these tools, which I think is interesting, because often sometimes when people think about AI art or just AI as an artist, it sometimes can be intimidating to people, and people are scared of AI in tons of different aspects unrelated to art. But what from my experience here is that the people who have been continue to be creative with how they are doing things with AI are the ones who have kind of pushed forward and stood out, which just kind of goes to show that it's not just some magic thing that's just going to take over and no one's going to create art. It's that people are creating art with a new tool that people hadn't heard of before, hadn't had access to before, which I think is a interesting path to go down.
I love that. And I think, tying it back into where the traditional art world benefits from kind of AI uses within NFTs, I think one interesting use case we're beginning to see emerge is for artists' estates, for artists who are now unfortunately not with us, and for those who are kind of classic masterpiece artists, being able to feed AI with their artworks and create new artwork inspired by their styles and kind of bring a new vivacity to artists who can no longer create original artworks. And part of the benefits of that can really be to bring funds back in to deeply underfunded galleries, estates, art conservation centers, especially post-COVID. And it's kind of, a really beautiful.
Emily, what are the legal issues with doing something like that?
Well, so it's an interesting question, because I think when we begin to feed, especially with GANs, when we begin to feed them artworks from a particular artist and let them produce new works, you end up with a question around originality of artwork. Where does the old artist's work end, and where does new originality from this AI begin? And if that's not being done by the estate who owns the rights to that artist's works, you end up with really interesting copyright questions.
That seems like an interesting question, even if they own the right to the artist's existing work.
Yeah.
You're saying they own the right to make additional new works by that artist?
To an extent, well, it's not by that artist, is the reality. It's by an AI. But I think that question...
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and I think that question in and of itself of who is the person to credit is a really interesting one. Do you credit the person who wrote the code? Do you credit the original artist? Do you credit the AI itself?
And are there estates doing this right now?
Not that I'm aware of, but I know, August, you have.
Yeah, I mean, I think this topic of conversation on just who owns AI outputs for all sorts of different models is a conversation that you can kind of just keep going back and forth on, because there are so many different potential nuances that can be added. Like if you're training a model on a big data set, and let's say your data set's 10,000 pieces of art and photography and all of that, well, if they're all owned by the same person, you could probably make a strong argument that that person should get some ownership of outputs from that model because they owned everything it was trained on. But it gets much more complicated once you start adding the number of owners of that data set, because let's say you have that 10,000 piece data set, but each piece in there is owned by a different person. Then you train a model on that, which gives outputs that are kind of just this average style of this enormous data set. Then you have this harder spot where it's probably not going to make sense to give each of the 10,000 owners of the data set like 1/10,000th of each output. So you kind of go down this path of the AI more is seeming to be kind of inspired by all these pieces from all these different people. And as you increase the size of the data set, you can kind of just keep going down that path, because it's kind of like if somebody went to a museum and they looked at hundreds of pieces of art, then they come home and they paint a painting and they were 100% inspired by everything in there. Well, not many people would make a strong argument that they have to give ownership of that painting that they just did to all these different people's art who they just saw that day. So in my opinion, I think that is kind of the approach that people will end up taking on data sets that are owned by lots of different people.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many questions that come up with AI ownership, originality, who the author is, and all the wonderful collaboration opportunities that NFTs make possible and that artists are taking advantage of. So we obviously can chat with each other forever, but I do want to see if there are any questions from the audience. Yeah.
I'm thinking about the opposite scenario. How does the NFT crypto artist get into the traditional art?
Okay, so wonderful question. How do NFT artists break into the traditional art world, which is a notorious hard thing to do for anyone? And I don't know if Emily want to take a crack at that.
One interesting opportunity for NFT artists is the fact that certain auction houses have really opened up to working with NFT artists on collaborations. And what that really does is bring that artist to a traditional market, and to collectors who might otherwise not have seen their work, might not have considered it. And I know that it's definitely happening on the other side of NFT collectors, kind of starting to collect traditional artworks. And auction houses such as Christie's have really found that people who were normally NFT native buyers, who then bought NFT artworks from their auction houses, proceeded to build traditional art collections with them because they felt that the traditional art world was more accessible to them, having had that kind of access point through the NFT world.
And I would say also getting into galleries that have physical spaces where someone from the traditional art world is going to wander in and see the work on the wall
Absolutely.
can help as well.
And I kind of think when you try and do this, it kind of ends up showing how difficult it can be, and which has kind of been one of the big upsides of the NFT space, is that it makes a lot of these steps easier, because if you're a traditional artist and you're trying to put something in a gallery to get seen, well, then you can pretty much expect you're going to give half of that sale to the gallery. So you have all these other problems on just getting seen in the first place, but I think it's similar steps. It's just some parts are harder than others, and even if they're not as hard, maybe you have to give away a bunch of the sale value and all that.
And I
Absolutely.
think this idea
Fair.
of being
Do we have time for one more question? Yep. Talk loudly, 'cause Yep.
Sure.
What AI software do we use, and how do we convert digital to phygital?
Sure. So for just training the models, the main open source tech that I started playing with was called StyleGAN by NVIDIA, and it's pretty much just a open sourced GAN, and you can put together your own data set, train on it for a few days on a cloud computer ideally, and then see how the outputs are and kind of take it from there. For digital to physical, what I've always done is I take an AI output, which normally will be something like 1024 by 1024, then I'll AI upsize it to maybe 8000 by 8000. Then I'll get it printed onto canvas and have it be framed canvas, which from my experience has been pretty good. And you can do printed onto metal also, which has looked pretty cool for different styles, but that's kind of the path for that.
I want to promote my phygital artwork that has a pop-up tonight on Broome Street. If you check my social media, I'm just Ann Spalter on everything. And also there are two really great AI things that you can use online that don't require any coding. Night Cafe Studio has text-to-image, and Playform.io has GANs. Then you can go start experimenting right away without having to code.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a good point for if you're trying to go down the non-technical path of doing things. If you try to do it with just open source code on GitHub, it's still hard, even though it's open source.
Yep.
All right.
We're out of time, but thank you so much for coming to our panel.
All right, thank you.